The following content is provided under a Creative Commons license. Your support will help MIT OpenCourseWare continue to offer high-quality educational resources for free. To make a donation or view additional materials from hundreds of MIT courses, visit MIT OpenCourseWare at ocw.mit.edu.
Okay, so what we're going to do today is the last in what I'd say is sort of the core set of lectures. Our core set of lectures, we started with talking about the market. We then moved on and talked about consumer theory and did a series of lectures on that. Now we're doing producer theory. This is the last in our series of lectures on producer theory. And then basically we move on to topics. So the remainder of the section, we'll talk about things like international trade, uncertainty, equity and efficiency, asymmetric information insurance markets. We'll basically move on to, in the last part of the course, showing you how you can apply what we've learned in the basics to answer a bunch of interesting real-world questions. So this is sort of the last of our core basics lectures. And what we're going to do here is sort of fit in something that kind of has fallen through the cracks, which is we've talked about firms and their decisions about how much to produce. And we've talked about sort of the output side, but we haven't talked about the input side at all. How do firms decide what kind of inputs to use and in what ratio to use, et cetera? We talked a bit about it. We talked about isoquants and isocosts and doing that trade-off between inputs. We haven't really talked about the input markets themselves. So firms go and they say, look, I've done my isoquants and isocosts and I want 63 workers. Well, they've then got to go to a market for labor and hire those workers. And how does that actually work? So today what we want to focus on is the demand side of input markets. That is, what's the actual market analysis by which a firm, having maximized its profits and deciding how many workers it wants, goes and actually finds those workers. So what we're going to do is talk about demand for factors. In particular today, we'll focus on the demand for labor. Although the demand for capital, the analysis will be very similar. Okay, but today we're going to focus on the demand for labor. Okay, and what we're going to do is begin by focusing on the demand for labor in a competitive factor market. So we're going to begin by talking about competitive factor markets. Competitive factor markets. What I mean by that is that basically a perfectly competitive factor market is one where just as perfect competition in output markets means there's lots of sellers selling the same good, a perfectly competitive factor market means there's lots of sellers, in this case workers, selling an identical good. That is their labor. So the notion is we're in a market where there's many workers firms could hire, all of whom are equally qualified for a job. Okay, so this is not obviously a high-tech market. This is some low-tech construction, other sort of blue-collar market where there's lots of workers out there who could equally well be qualified for a job. And in fact, what we're going to assume is that basically there's a perfectly flat labor supply curve. Okay, let's assume a perfectly flat labor supply curve. Okay, perfectly elastic labor supply, just to make life easy. Obviously, it's not true in reality, but let's assume we're looking at some market with perfectly elastic labor supply. Okay? Now, how do we think about what happens in factor markets in that world? Well, once again, let's start with the short run. Okay? And so in the short run, capital's fixed. So a firm has said, look, I've done my short-run profit maximization, my isoquants and isocosts. I've decided how many workers I want given a fixed level of capital. Okay? And that basically gives me some demand for labor. Okay? I can derive a demand for labor curve by essentially saying at different wage rates, given a fixed capital price, that will shift my isocost curve. If you remember your profit, you're going back to being producer theory, at different wage rates, that will shift my isocost curve. That will cause me to demand different amounts of labor. So that traces out a demand curve, for labor. Okay? And we can see that graphically, okay, in figure 18.1. So you've got a perfectly elastic labor supply curve, and then you've got a downward sloping labor demand curve. And that labor demand curve comes from the profit maximization. The other way to think about how we get there, though, is interesting, is say, okay, is to ask, how do we think about the marginal benefit versus the marginal cost of hiring another worker? Okay? We know the marginal cost is the wage. That's easy. What's the marginal benefit of hiring another worker? Well, recall that another unit of labor raises output by the marginal product of labor. Remember the marginal product of labor? We talked about this a while ago. This is delta Q, delta L. So the next worker raises your output by an amount marginal product of labor. Okay? That's what you get from the next worker. Okay? But that's a quantity. In profit, the firm cares about profit, not quantity. So what it cares about is revenues. So the revenues from the next worker would be the marginal revenues that are made on that next unit times the marginal product of labor. Okay? That's the marginal benefit to the firm of the next unit of labor, is the marginal product that that worker produces times the marginal revenue the firm raises from selling that next unit. Okay, so it's sort of they have to consider two things, two margins. How much is it worth them to sell that next unit, and how much will be produced by that next unit of worker. Okay, so if we have a perfectly competitive if we have a perfectly competitive labor market, the marginal product of labor, okay, if we have a perfectly competitive labor market, okay, the marginal cost is going to be the wage. So we're going to set this equal to the wage. Okay? So in a perfectly competitive labor market, the marginal cost of another worker is the wage, and this is the marginal benefit of another worker. So this is going to be the condition that firms are going to use to decide how many workers to hire. Okay? Now, let's and we're going to call this the marginal revenue product of labor. So you're going to set the marginal revenue product of labor equal to the wage. That's going to be your profit maximizing condition. The marginal revenue product. Marginal product is about quantities. Marginal revenue product is about dollars. What's the dollars that the next unit of labor produces for you? Is your marginal revenue product. Okay. Now, if the output market is also perfectly competitive, that is, imagine for a minute now, take one further step. Not only a perfectly competitive labor supply, but let's also have a perfectly competitive output market. So it's not a monopolist. It's selling in a perfectly competitive output market. Then we know what the marginal revenue is. We know the marginal revenue is the price. So for a perfectly competitive output market, we can rewrite this as price times marginal product of labor equals the wage. Okay, because we know the marginal revenue is the price in a perfectly competitive output market. Okay? And basically, this makes it even easier to see, which is to say, look, how many workers do you hire? You hire until the wage you pay that worker is equal to the price you sell your good for times how many goods that worker produces. If the worker produces 100 goods, if one worker produces 100 goods, and each good sells for 100, then you pay the worker, then you're willing to pay the worker $10,000. Okay? Basically, that determines, that is going to determine your demand curve. And so the labor demand curve is also labeled the marginal product of labor curve. The marginal revenue product of labor curve, I'm sorry. So basically, why is this diminishing? Why is it downward sloping? Because remember, the marginal product of labor is diminishing. Okay? The marginal product of labor is diminishing. As a result, this curve is downward sloping. Okay? Now, here price is fixed, so it doesn't matter. Marginal revenue also is diminishing, so that's going to make it even more downward sloping in the more general case. But in this specific case of perfectly competitive output markets, where this is just a constant price, you get this downward sloping marginal revenue product of labor curve because the marginal product of labor is diminishing, as we talked about. Okay. Now, so that's basically the analysis of what we see for a perfectly competitive factor market. Okay, so the equilibrium is basically where the labor supply curve, which is perfectly elastic, okay, intersects this marginal revenue product curve, which is determined by how productive the workers are and how much money they're making for you with each unit they produce. And that gets you the short-run equilibrium. Okay? Now, remember, once again, okay, anyway, cool questions about that. Questions about what we're doing here. So it's just basically, that just says the underlying analysis of where demand for labor comes from. Okay, it's going to, or where the equilibrium level of labor is going to come from. It's going to come from an intersection of this demand with the supply, which is flat. Now, how is this going to differ in the long run? Well, let me ask the question this way. Forget the math, forget the graphics. Let me just ask intuitively. In the long run, okay, in the long run, do we think the long run demand for workers will be more elastic or less elastic than the short run demand? In general, will the long run demand for workers, with the long run demand curve, this is short run demand curve, will the long run demand curve typically be more elastic or less elastic than the short run demand curve for workers? So let me take a guess. Yeah. Go ahead. More elastic. Why? It's more elastic, but intuitively, don't worry about the graph. I'm just looking for intuition. Yeah.
Because in the long run, you can substitute capital.
Exactly. More substitutability equals more elasticity. Okay, general intuition you want to remember for this course. In the long run, since I can substitute towards capital, then that long-run demand curve for labor will be even more elastic than the short-run demand curve. I'm not going to work through math or anything. I just want you to remember that intuition. Okay? That basically long-run demand curves, when you have more margins you can use, that's more substitutability. That means more elasticity. Okay? So in the long run, so basically the idea is in the short run, if the wage increases for workers, all you can do is if you hire fewer workers, you just produce less. So you're sort of stuck. But in the long run, if the wage increases, you just say, fine, I'll just use machines instead. Okay, so in the long run, you can substitute away from workers towards machines. So in the long run, your demand curve is going to be more elastic. Okay? Questions about that? Now, this is all relatively straightforward, just follows from producer theory, the sort of stuff you had to do in the exam last night. Let's now talk about a little more interesting case, which is one of my other favorite words in economics, which is the case of monopsony. Not monopoly, but monopsony. We've been talking in lectures about monopoly, which is a case where one firm is the only seller in the output market. Okay? One firm is the only seller in the output market. A parallel case on input markets is the case of monopsony, okay, which is when one firm is the only demander in the input market. Okay, so monopoly is when one firm is the only seller in the output market. The parallel in input markets is monopsony, which is where one firm is the only buyer in the input market. And the key thing that's going to drive monopsony is that basically when there are barriers to exit from a factor market, okay, it's going to create a monopsony. And anytime there are barriers to exit, anytime workers are stuck and cannot leave a market, workers are stuck working one place, that will give the employer market power over those workers. Okay? The classic example is the company town. Okay? In the 1800s, when there were mining operations, and basically they'd come in and they'd hire people, and basically there's nowhere else to work in the area. These were areas which were sort of dying agricultural areas. There was nowhere else to work. You'd go work for the mining company. Well, that mining company had tremendous monopsony power over you, because basically there was nowhere else to work within a decent area. There weren't cars yet. You couldn't just commute to somewhere else. Okay? A modern example is MIT's monopsony power over me. Okay? MIT has monopsony power over me. Why is that? Well, that's because basically my life's pretty comfortable now. I'm in a house I've lived in a long time. My kids are in schools I like. I've got a lot of friends. It'd be a real pain in the ass for me to move. Okay? And as a result, MIT has some, not unlimited, okay, don't tell them, okay, but they have some monopsony power over me because they know that that's a barrier to my exit. To my exiting MIT, a barrier is that I'm very comfortable and satisfied, and basically, given the nature tenets of psychology, it is harder to move someone with a pull than with a push. Okay? So someone could come and try to pull me away, but basically going to have to blow me away with an offer. Once again, don't tell MIT this. They have to blow me away an offer because basically I'm pretty satisfied. And that satisfaction inherently gives MIT some monopsony power over me. Okay? Now, the question is, what implications does this have? And the implications are quite interesting. Okay? And what they are is sort of a complicated flip of the monopoly case. Let's look at figure 18.2. Here's the example of a company town. Okay? Now, let's imagine a labor market where you've got some labor demand curve, the marginal revenue product of labor, MRPL, and some labor supply curve. And now labor supply is upward sloping. So this is not a perfectly competitive labor market now. Okay? This is labor supply is now upward sloping. So the demand curve for labor, we're going to say, is 60 minus L. So in our example, the marginal revenue product of labor is going to be 60 minus L. The notion is you have some downward sloping demand curve for labor because of diminishing marginal product. The more workers you hire, the higher the wage, the fewer basically you're willing to pay the wage you're willing to pay is diminishing in the number of workers. To get that first worker, you'll pay a high wage because you got to produce something. But as you hire more workers, the wage you're willing to pay falls. So the demand curve is downward sloping. And let's say that our labor supply curve is that the amount of labor workers are willing to supply is the wage over 2. I'm just making this up. These are just made up numbers just to make the math work. Okay? So it's just an upward sloping labor supply curve. A higher wage calls forth more labor. Okay? So basically, let's ask what happens in the competitive case. Well, in the competitive case, you set supply equals to demand. Well, supply is that firms are going to set the wage equals 60 minus L. Labor supply is L equals W over 2. Okay? So we could just have two equations and two unknowns. We can solve and get that the amount of labor supplied in the competitive case is 20 units. 20 hours, 20 days, weeks, whatever. Okay? 20 units. Okay? That basically, that's the competitive outcome. And the wage, we can read off the labor supply curve. If they're going to supply 20 units, they're going to need a wage of 40. Right? So once again, we can read that off the labor supply or the labor demand curve. If there's going to be 20 workers, the wage is going to be 40. So the wage, I'll call labor competitive, and the wage competitive is 40. Okay? So in a competitive market, with this demand and supply curve, you should know by now, you just set them equal, you solve, you get an outcome of 20 workers working at a wage of 40. Now let's imagine this isn't the competitive case. Let's imagine it's a monopsony case. Let's imagine this firm has monopsony power. Workers can't exit. Okay? And let's further assume that the firm cannot wage discriminate. Just as we talk about monopolists that couldn't price discriminate, we're going to talk about a firm that can't wage discriminate. It has to pay one wage to all its workers. And we'll come back once again to this assumption. Just as we talked about price discrimination, we'll come back and talk about wage discrimination. But for now, assume a non-wage discriminating monopolist. They have to pay one wage to all their workers. Okay? Well, what that means is just as when a monopolist wanted to sell more goods, it had to lower the price. If a monopsonist wants to hire more workers, it has to raise the wage. Okay? Parallel thing. Just a monopolist had to lower the price to sell more units because it had to respect the demand curve. A monopsonist, if it wants to hire more workers, has to raise the wage because it has to respect the supply curve. Okay? Parallel. And what this will do is that will lead them to underhire workers at too low a wage. Just as monopoly led firms to underproduce at too high a price, monopsony will lead to underhiring at too high a wage. Okay? So once again, to think about this, let's think about the firm's decision to hire an extra worker. Okay? Well, what is the firm's total expenditure on labor? Its expenditure on labor is the wage, which is a function of the amount of labor, times the amount of labor. That's the expenditure on labor. Okay? So its marginal expenditure, if you take the derivative, okay, is going to be W plus dW dL times L. That's its marginal expenditure. That's going to be if you want to hire an additional worker, what's the marginal cost? Well, I want to hire additional worker, what's the marginal cost? I've got to pay him W, and to hire him, I have to raise the wage so I have to pay all my previous workers more as well. Okay? So to hire one more worker, I've got to pay that worker a wage, and in order to entice him, I've got to raise the wage, which means I've got to pay a higher wage to all my previous workers too. Once again, remember, I have to pay one wage. Okay? So if I'm going to hire that worker, okay, there is the same poisoning effect that we saw with monopolists. With monopolists, the poisoning effect was if I want to sell one more unit, I'm going to have to undercut my price on all previous units. For a monopsonist, if I want to hire one more worker, I'm going to have to pay all my previous workers more. And that's going to mean that there's sort of a poisoning effect in reverse. That's going to mean it's going to cost me a lot of money to hire that extra worker. Okay? So we can actually derive now a marginal expenditure curve just as we derived a marginal revenue curve for the monopolist. The marginal expenditure curve, okay, so we know expenditure is W of L times L, okay, and we know that we know from the supply curve we can rewrite this as W equals 2L, right? So that says that the expenditure on labor is 2L times L. Okay, so plugging in from the supply curve, the expenditure in labor is 2L times L. Okay, it's wage as a function of labor times labor, so 2L times L. So that means that marginal expenditure is 4L. The marginal expenditure curve, the marginal expenditure is 4L. Okay, so we can now draw a marginal expenditure curve that's steeper than the labor supply curve. Once again, it's confusing, but it's all parallel. It's just we're flipping everything around for a monopolist. Okay? Instead of drawing that marginal revenue curve that was steeper than the product demand curve, now we're drawing a marginal expenditure curve which is steeper than the labor supply curve. And once again, we will find the intersection. To find the optimum, we'll find the intersection of that marginal expenditure curve with marginal cost. Well, here we'll find the intersection of marginal expenditure curve, with labor demand. So the parallel was we found the intersection of marginal revenue with marginal cost. Now I'll find the intersection of marginal expenditure with labor demand. That intersection is going to happen at 12 workers. Okay? So the firm is only going to hire 12 workers. Okay? But what wage is it going to pay? Once again, our first temptation is to look at that high intersection and say, well, at that intersection, what's the wage? We didn't put that on the diagram for a reason. Maybe we should have to throw you off. Okay? Remember, to figure out the wage, you've got to respect the labor supply curve. Just like you have to respect the product demand curve to figure out the price. So what's the wage if they want to hire 12 workers? They pay 24. Okay? So the monopsonist is going to hire 12 workers and pay 24. It's going to hire the number of workers where marginal expenditure equals the labor demand. That's going to determine the quantity, and the wage is they're going to read off the labor supply curve. Okay? And as a result, this firm is going to underhire at too low a wage relative to the perfect competition. Relative to the competition, they're going to hire fewer workers at a lower wage. Okay? So basically, if you think about this, let's come back to the example of MIT. MIT would like to expand the economics department. Okay? But to do so, it's got to poach some economics professor away from another university. Well, if it poaches another professor away from another university, then, and let's say that MIT pays all its professors the same. Okay? If they're going to poach a professor away from another university, they are going to have to pay the rest of us more. Okay? And that's going to cost them a ton of money. So they think we'd rather have a little bit more crowded undergrad class. Don't really see it here today, but maybe in general. More crowded undergrad class, okay? And not get that extra professor to avoid having to pay a higher wage to all our existing professors. Okay? So as a result, MIT will underhire professors. Okay? And they'll underhire professors at too low a wage. And what's going to determine basically how big monopsony power is? What determined how big monopoly power was? What was the key thing? I want to say what it is because I'll give the idea. It was the key thing that determined the size of monopoly power. Yeah. Elasticity of demand. So just like that, the key factors to determine the market power of monopsonists is going to be the elasticity of supply of labor. The elasticity of demand for a good is what determined the market power of monopolists, because as goods were more elastically demanded, they had less ability to jack up the price. The elasticity of supply of labor is what's going to determine the market power of monopsonists, because if I have more options, they can't underpay me. So if I'm very willing to move to another university, okay, that is, as my labor supply curve gets flatter, then there's less market power that they have. In particular, the perfectly competitive labor market, there's no monopsony power at all. Okay? So monopsony power is a function of the options facing their workers. Okay? Questions about that? Now, the key question this all raises, at least when I first learned about it and think about it, is I guess it maybe was sort of plausible to think that monopolists can only charge one price for their good. That like, the iPod is kind of what the iPod costs, and you couldn't start charging different amounts for iPods to different people. That would kind of seem kind of get bad press and stuff. But it seems a little bit stranger to think that employers have to pay one wage to all their workers. I mean, in fact, as a matter of fact, we know that MIT doesn't pay the same to all its professors. Okay? There is some wage discrimination. Okay? In particular, it's a well-known fact that the way to get a raise as a professor is to get an offer from another university. Because basically, MIT, the pay structure of professors at competitive departments like economics is typically they will underpay you until another university comes and says that you're worth more, and then they'll ratchet up to try to match them. Okay? So there is wage discrimination in practice at universities, as there is in most workplaces. There's very few workplaces where all workers make the same. There's wage discrimination. So does that mean this model's irrelevant? And the answer is no, it doesn't, because there are still major barriers to perfect wage discrimination. There's some wage discrimination, but there's a lot of barriers to perfect wage discrimination. Okay? The most important one is workplace norms or fairness. Okay? So what MIT should do, here's the optimal MIT strategy. The older the professor, the less they should pay him. Not because they're less productive. Imagine productivity is constant. It's not. We get less productive as we get older. But put that aside. It's because the older you are, the less likely you are to get up and move. Okay? And the less likely, quite frankly, other universities are going to want to hire you and take you away, because no one gets that excited about hiring a 60-year-old. Okay? So what MIT should do is take all the 60-year-old professors and say, we're cutting your wage in half. Okay? Or by a third. Because the truth is, the wage is already, we've written our lectures already. The wage is already well above our marginal product. Okay? We're all doing pretty well anyway. And the truth is, people wouldn't leave. So why doesn't MIT do that? MIT doesn't do that because I'm going to someday be one of those old guys. And I say, wait, I'm getting there rapidly. I say, wait a second. If they're going to do that to when I'm 60, I'm going to get out of here while I'm 45. Okay? Because I don't want to be in that situation, because that's unfair. Workplace norms matter. Okay? Employers really do not like to discriminate within the workplace because it breeds bad blood and ultimately can lower productivity. Okay? And this is something that we miss in our basic models. We don't have sort of fairness or workplace norms in our models. So wage is just about setting the wage that maximizes the profit, which means screwing the 60-year-olds. But in fact, in reality, okay, that's not the way workplaces work. And that's what the point of labor economics is. And if you're interested in this, you can take a course. We have an excellent course in labor economics that follows up on these issues. But a key issue is how much wage discrimination can be done given workplace norms, given the sort of notions of fairness we have. And the answer is it might be kind of tough, because basically MIT doesn't want to worry about upsetting all its younger faculty by mistreating its older faculty. Okay? And partly that could be solidarity. Partly some of those guys are my friends, and I feel bad for them. But partly it could be just more selfish, which is I don't want to be at a place that's going to discriminate in that way against me when I get older. Okay? And that's just something that's missed by the basic 1401 models. Okay, questions about that? Yeah?
Couldn't you model the person's life wage or something?
So yeah, that's exactly. So what you could do is you could say to people, look, when we're hiring you, we're going to overpay you relative to other universities when you're young, and we'll underpay you when you're older. Okay, and so on a lifetime basis, you'll be fine. Okay, what would the problem with that be? So let's say they say I'm going to, yeah. I'd leave. As soon as I reached that point where I was being paid more elsewhere that didn't pay this downward slope. And in fact, there's a lot of interesting labor economics theory which says the optimal form of labor contract is actually the opposite. It's to overpay when you're old and underpay when you're young. And the notion is to get people to want to stick around. And so in some sense, common labor theory says exactly the opposite of what you suggested. You want to overpay older people to get them to stick around. And for many years in America, that's often the way labor markets worked. We had very generous pensions and health benefits and high wages for older workers. That equilibrium is now breaking down. Because in this more competitive labor market, you can't afford to overpay those older workers, because then you can't attract the younger workers in the first place. And we're moving towards a flatter profile by age. But that's exactly the set of interesting issues we have to deal with in labor economics in setting pay that we don't really get into here. Okay, other questions or comments on that? Okay, of course, there's another reason why MIT couldn't do this, which is it's against the law. Okay? We have age discrimination laws in our country, which say you cannot discriminate against people based purely on their age. MIT could say, well, look, I could demonstrate a productivity difference. This guy's publishing fewer articles than he did 20 years ago, etc. But they do have a legal hurdle to come as well as an administrative hurdle. It'll be a pain in the ass for MIT to have to figure out exactly how to shift their wage schedule to do all this, and that causes administrative costs and extra deans and extra things, and they just don't want to deal with it. Okay? So there are other barriers as well, which is administrative costs and legal costs. But I think probably the main barrier is just the difficult issue of workplace norms and how it affects people's view, the productivity of the workers who are behind, while you get rid of these older workers who are underpaid, these older workers who aren't as productive. Okay? Questions or thoughts on that? Okay, so now with this monopsony model in mind, I want to go back and revisit an interesting, a major topic that we talked about early in the course. And a couple times in this course, we talked about, as an example of how governments can screw up markets, we talked about the minimum wage. And we talked about if you take a competitive labor market and impose a minimum wage above the competitive level, that could lead to deadweight loss. Because what will happen is, at that higher wage, firms will want fewer workers. Workers who would be happy to work at the competitive wage will not be able to work. Trades which would make social welfare higher won't be made, and there'll be deadweight loss. Okay? The monopsony model says that may not be the case. Because the monopsony model, a minimum wage can play the same role that optimal price regulation played with monopolists. Remember with monopolists, we said you could set, if you regulate a monopolist and force them to charge the competitive price, then you could actually force them to the competitive outcome. Well, if a minimum wage is set above the prevailing wage, but that's because a monopsony prevailing wage is too low, and the minimum wage is set at the competitive level, then you could actually increase employment and improve outcomes with a minimum wage. Sort of counterintuitive, so let's look at it. Pretty confusing. Let's look at figure 18.3. Figure 18.3 once again parallels a figure you saw on the entire flip side for price regulation of monopolist. This is the parallel, which is wage regulation of a monopsonist. So let's walk through this. It's pretty confusing. So let's walk through this slowly. Initially, you have a monopsonist who is hiring at the point where their marginal expenditure curve, which is the dashed line and then the solid line. So the line ME1 is the original marginal expenditure curve. It goes from, it's the ME1 plus the ME2. It's that segment, that line, which is once again more or less than the supply curve. That intersects the demand curve at a labor supply L1. So they hire L1 workers and they pay a wage W1. Okay? That's the initial monopsony equilibrium. The competitive equilibrium is where supply equals demand. That would be hiring L2 workers and paying a higher wage W2. So the monopsonist is under hiring relative to the competitive firm. Now let's say the government rolls in and says, we're going to set a minimum wage, and we're going to happen to get it right and set it at the competitive wage level, W2. Well, now let's think about the monopsonist calculus. The monopsonist new marginal expenditure curve is the old one for the solid segment. So where it says ME2, that solid segment is still the marginal expenditure curve. So as they're thinking about hiring additional workers, they're working down that curve. But once they get to L2 workers, they can't lower the wage anymore. So that marginal expenditure curve, they can no longer lower the wage below W2. So their new marginal expenditure curve hops down and becomes a minimum wage. So the new marginal expenditure curve is the two segments labeled ME2. It's the horizontal segment from the y-axis to E2. And then it jumps up to that upward sloping segment above L2, to the right of L2. So the new marginal expenditure curve is basically at a wage that's above the minimum wage to continue to behave like a monopsonist. But once you hit the minimum wage and they can't lower the wage anymore, what happens? The poisoning effect goes away, just like we talked about with the monopolist. Essentially what this has done has gotten the poisoning effect, has killed the poisoning effect. Because it said, as you're thinking about hiring that next worker, okay, so you think about hiring that next worker to the right of L1, Typically you say, I don't want to hire them because I'm going to have to raise my wage to everybody else. But you're already paying everybody else a higher wage. You're already paying everybody else the minimum wage. So there's no poisoning effect. You're not going to have to pay them a higher wage to hire that next worker because you're already paying them that higher wage. So just as optimal price regulation undoes the poisoning effect on the demand side, optimal wage regulation undoes that poisoning effect on the supply side and can lead you to the optimal outcome. So minimum wage can actually increase employment. Pretty bizarre. Okay, minimum wage is our whipping boy for this course about how it causes deadweight loss and leads to lower employment. Here we're saying actually if we start a monopsony equilibrium, a minimum wage could increase employment. Of course, as you should know, the minimum wage could reduce employment even in a monopsony setting if it gets set too high. So if the minimum wage got set very high, Jessica, maybe something we should actually add for next year. So if you can imagine a minimum wage that's set very high, okay, that could lead to a level of labor supply that's actually below the monopsony level. So just as with optimum price regulation, okay, just with optimum price regulation, we talked about setting a price too high could make things worse. Setting minimum wage high too high could make things worse. So it's ultimately an empirical question of does the minimum wage raise employment, which would require two conditions, a monopsony market and a well-set minimum wage, or does it lower employment, which can happen either with a competitive labor market or it can happen with a poorly set minimum wage. Okay? This is pretty confusing, but so you probably have to go home and think more about this. But are there questions now about anything that's not apparent from the diagram? Okay, so now we get to, this is basically why we have empirical economics. Because we have empirical economics, well, really, we have two reasons. One is sometimes we know the direction of what we're looking for. We want to measure its magnitude. Sometimes we don't even know the direction, not to mention the magnitude. Here's a case we don't even know the direction. Will increase the minimum wage raise or lower employment, and by how much? Okay? Well, how do we test this? Well, the traditional way to look at it is to say, okay, well, the minimum wage changes over time. Let's look at what happens. Let's look at what happens to employment when the minimum wage goes up. Okay? And what people found was that increase in the minimum wage tended to be associated with lower employment. When the minimum wage went up, employment fell. So people took that to mean that basically there was a situation where we were either in a competitive market or we're screwing up the monopsony market by setting too high a minimum wage. Because when we raised the minimum wage, employment fell. Okay. And what is wrong with drawing that conclusion from that evidence? Or could someone tell me a story about why that might not be a convincing piece of evidence? Why the fact that we raise the minimum wage, when we raise the minimum wage, employment falls, why that may not be, by itself be compelling? What problem you might have with that piece of evidence? You read that in the New York Times tomorrow. You know, look at this graph. We raise the minimum wage, employment falls, clearly the minimum wage is bad. What should your first thought be upon reading that article? Well, what do we care about? We care about causation, not correlation. Okay? So what could be causing this to be a correlation and not correlation, but not a causation effect? You want to try? Yeah.
It would depend, like, when you raise the minimum wage.
Right. In particular, what story might cause this effect?
Like if, they're hitting a depression and they decide to raise the minimum
Right. What if governments worried about workers in bad economies? That's exactly when they raise the minimum wage. What if the government raised the minimum wage in bad economy? Because that's exactly when they're worried about workers suffering. Then you would see that a higher minimum wage is associated with lower employment, but it's got nothing to do with a higher minimum wage. It's got to do with the fact that you raise the minimum wage when employment's falling anyway. It's causation versus correlation. Okay? You have to be a critical reader of evidence like this. The minimum wage is not handed down by God. Okay? It's determined by legislators who are subject to political pressures which may depend on the state of the economy. If the minimum wage increases when employment happens to be falling, then it'll look like the minimum wage has harmed employment when it really hasn't. Okay? So, what do we do about this? Okay, what do we do about this? What we do about this is to try to think about a way we can find a causal relationship between the minimum wage and employment. And one way to do that is to try to find cases where a minimum wage increased and yet we know there was no independent change in economic activity. And the way economists have done that is by looking at state minimum wages. Turns out a lot of states actually set minimum wages higher than the national minimum wage. Okay, not really much anymore because the national minimum wage has gone up a lot the last decade. But about a decade ago, the national minimum wage, or about 15 years ago, the national minimum wage was at a real historical minimum, okay, in real terms. And a lot of states exceeded that in setting their minimum wage. So take two states, for example, New Jersey and Pennsylvania. Okay? New Jersey raised its minimum wage. Pennsylvania doesn't. But any economic shock is going to hit New Jersey and Pennsylvania pretty similarly. They're both right next to each other on the East Coast. Any recessions get them pretty similarly. So what you could do is you could ask what happens to employment in New Jersey when they raise their minimum wage relative to Pennsylvania, which suffers the same economic shocks but doesn't raise its minimum wage. That is, we try to achieve the gold standard. What's the gold standard? The gold standard is a randomized trial. What we'd like is literally like a trial where randomly we change the minimum wage randomly at different places and different times. Okay, that's never going to happen. Okay? So we try to approximate it with what we call a natural experiment or a quasi-experiment, which say, are there sort of experimental interventions that nature gives us, even if not perfectly randomized trials? And this is one. Here's a situation where you have two states very similar. Okay? One raises its minimum wage, and one doesn't. Okay? And they're set by economic shocks. So you can look at that. Another approach people have taken to this, another way people have taken this approach is say, okay, well, when the minimum wage increases, it's going to have different effects in different places. And why is that? That's because the minimum wage is going to be higher relative to the market wage in some areas than others. So, for example, when they raise the minimum wage $1 nationally, okay, most people in Massachusetts already make more than they raise it to. So it's not going to affect Massachusetts much. Whereas in Mississippi, that's a big hit. Okay? So once again, you can compare states that were given national raise. You can compare states that were hit harder by that raise to states that were hit less hard. Another way to try to do this. A number of studies have done this, and they've come up with the striking conclusion that the minimum wage, if anything, raises employment. At least at the levels that we've seen over the last 15, 20 years. Changes in the minimum wage are actually associated with modest but increases in employment, and certainly no decreases. Okay? They've been associated with modest increases in employment and not decreases. And this is really, really striking. This is pretty striking because this is something that, you know, economists just never even really took seriously. This is, we always taught this, the minimum wage is the bad boy of economics. And this is saying, no, in fact, if you take it seriously and look at the evidence compellingly, you can actually see, look at the evidence carefully, you can actually see that a minimum wage can actually increase employment as this model shows. Okay? Now, this is still the subject of some controversy. There's still a lot of work on it. But it then raises the question of, well, how can this really be? I mean, don't we have a pretty competitive labor market? How do we really have a monopsony labor market? And the answer is that if you look at who's getting the minimum wage, it's largely younger and low-skilled workers who don't have a lot of employment options. So basically, McDonald's in a given area in a city could have some monopsony power. Because basically, people don't have cars. These low-income urban youths don't have cars. They can't go somewhere else to work. They don't have skills, so they can't even work retail because they don't have good enough skills to work retail. So McDonald's sort of has them. McDonald's has some monopsony power over them because McDonald's is the job they can get, or McDonald's and Burger King together maybe are the jobs they can get. That gives them some monopsony power. So given that's where the minimum wage is going to bite the most, it's maybe not implausible that the minimum wage could actually increase employment, which is what we see in these studies. Okay? Questions about that? Yeah?
I know that in monopoly power, there's like antitrust to prevent them from talking to each other. In monopoly, like, would it be possible that the companies would talk to set like?
Yeah, exactly. So this is so let's take my inner city example. McDonald's isn't the only employer. There's Burger King and Wendy's and lots of other low-skilled employers. The notion is, if there's a few of them, that should be enough to break any monopsony power unless they collude. And so likewise, just as there's not supposed to be collusion on the output side, there are laws against collusion on the input side. Okay, in the same way. But once again, just those laws are hard to enforce on the output side, they're hard to enforce. Because basically, what you can do is they can get together in the back room or do it, or they can just say, Wendy's and Burger King can wait and see what McDonald's does and then just follow in lockstep. So there's lots of ways to get around those rules. But yes, just as there's antitrust laws on the output side, there are labor market laws on the input side, which get in the way of collusion. The difference is basically those are more on a sector by sector basis. So, for example, basically, if a sector is basically the unionization of the workers affects the collusion ability of the employers. So if workers are unionized, it's more lax in terms of allowing employers to collude as well because the workers are colluding. If workers aren't unionized, they're less lax, and it's a complicated body of labor law about that. Okay, other questions? Yeah?
So it would be bad for unions to try and get like a industry-wide standard wage, or?
Well, that's about efficiency versus equity. If a union got an industry-wide standard wage, then that's going to penalize the talented workers who would want to go work elsewhere and help the less talented workers. And basically, a lot of the complaints employers have about unions is that they lose their talented workers because the union doesn't allow them to pay those differentials. Teachers is a great example that's very controversial right now, which is should there be merit pay for teachers? A lot of teachers say no, there shouldn't be merit pay because that's going to violate workplace norms and it's unfair, but we might not be getting the most talented people into teaching as a result. All right? Okay, so we'll come back next time and talk about international, start a sort of topics part of the course by talking about international trade and whether it's good or bad. Answer, it's good, but we'll talk about why.